View from the top. Business leaders review the news on video for FT.com. This week, George Roberts and Henry Kravis of KKR. In this segment discussing the government's role going forward.
Before we get to your initiatives in the capital markets and asset management, which I definitely want to touch on, let me just ask you finally on this part of our interview, if Tim Geithner was to say to you, what steps would you recommend? How do we cure this, to use your word? What are your prescriptions for him?
Well, I think they're doing some of the right things. Obviously, the governments in the world have, basically have backstopped the banks. We have too big to fail. That's the right thing to do. They've stabilized the banking system.
I think the one thing that Bernanke did exceptionally well is he understood what could happen if they didn't move quickly and very decisively. And if you compare what the EU did, the European Central Bank compared to the U.S. Federal Reserve, the U.S. Federal Reserve started lowering rates much sooner and much more dramatically than the European Central Bank did.
How do you see the opportunities that have been thrown up by this incredible dislocation? Is the government a good partner for KKR?
Look, I think, it really depends what the situation is. To make a blanket statement saying the government is good or bad as a partner, I don't think you can do that. There's no question that the government does have, obviously, a much cheaper capital than anything we will ever have. We looked at quite a few of the banks over time, and we turned them down. And once because we couldn't see what was in the banks, even though we were in and looking, you still couldn't see, okay, where's bottom for this thing? And then once the government put their TARP program together and the $700 billion, then they were the competitor. They provided the capital at a much cheaper rate, so we couldn't compete with that. That's correct. I think there may be some programs where it will be appropriate for us to partner with the government. I think one area in particular that I think is a very big need and an area where we will have opportunities to participate is in infrastructure.
Yeah, most of the government that we're looking at for an infrastructure state and local governments as opposed to the federal government. This all boils down to our investment thesis that we have, which is, can we understand what's there and can we create value out of it? And simply just buying a pool of assets and a highly levered vehicle because the government's willing to give you more leverage than the markets will be, and sitting there and just running off the assets and giving the money back to your partners is not what we do. So if we can find a way that meets our criterion so that we can understand the dynamics of what we're doing and we can find some way to create value out of it other than just clipping coupons, we'll be very interested in it.
Many people have voiced reservations about the government's wanting to be able to change the rules. Is that something that disturbs you, that potentially the government can change the rules? You
mean the United States government going in and abrogating and changing contracts and practices? Sure. It should bother everybody in this country that we're a nation of laws and precedents and rules that have been established, and for somebody to come back in after the fact and retroactively change a law or put in a tax that changes the outcome of something does not give the markets confidence.
Do you think the government understands that to get private capital in, private capital needs to earn a certain return on that capital?
Well, sure. Yeah, they understand it. The question is, they understand it, but are they willing to accept it? What happens if that return is too high? Is that going to bother the taxpayer? Is that going to bother the government representatives? Oh my gosh, they took our money and they made all this money on it. Should we put some kind of a surtax on it? That's crazy. If they're just talking about it will scare away people from wanting to participate in any program, whatever it is.
You know, private equity has lots of other alternatives as opposed to financing government programs. You know, we have opportunities in our existing portfolio to put more capital in, to make more investments and do what we need to do. You know, businesses that we know something about, whether we're not taking the risk of somebody changing the rules on you. It's sort of like, you know, Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football. You know, the football's there, and you know, Charlie every fall runs down to kick it, and Lucy picks up the ball, and Charlie falls on his butt. I mean, you don't want a system that works that way.
That was George Roberts and Henry Kravis of KKR on the government's role going forward. You can also hear them discussing the evolution of KKR. Next week, Bob Kelly of the Bank of New York Mellon reviews the news on video for FT.com's View from the Top.